Hello and welcome back to Ms. McGee's Critical Thinking and Analysis class at Fremont College Online. Today we're going to talk about different kinds of fallacies and reasonings. It's Unit 11, and the book does a very good job of helping me explain it to you, and I really urge you to do your reading in the book if you need some extra explanation for these concepts, because I know some of them are very complex and it takes a few times for us to really grasp a hold of them. So in Unit 11, we're going to talk about inductive reasoning. When you think of inductive reasoning, you think of something very specific, and you draw conclusions from that to make it a very general idea or concept or statement. There's many ways in which we can achieve inductive reasoning. One of the most common ways, and we do it every day really without thinking about it, is we use our senses. And you know the 5 senses that we would use would be sight, touch, taste, smell, and hearing. We also have like supplemental senses that happen to us, that occur to us just on a natural basis. The one that I like to always refer to is the sense of time. You know, sometimes when you know that you have to wake up early in the next morning, you've got what we call an internal clock, and you'll wake up maybe without even having an alarm clock because we have that supplementary or inherent sense of time. Those are supplemental or auxiliary senses that we have. We have a sense of weight, energy, pressure, color, lightness, and darkness. These are senses that we have without really even thinking about it. We know when it's dark. We know when it's light. Okay, so those are all reasoning techniques that we use for inductive reasoning. Reasoning from enumeration. Inductive can involve a whole simple counting of parts to order to draw a conclusion from the whole. Counting of parts to draw a conclusion from the whole. Analogous reasoning. Inductive reasoning also draws conclusions from making comparisons in the form of an analogy. So you can think of an analogy as a comparison, as taking two things and finding the likenesses or the differences of two things and making an analogy. Discovering patterns. Now this is very common in particularly the legal field, where we look for patterns in behavior or occurrences so that we can do our inductive reasoning. Reasoning from and about causes. Again, very skillful people use these kinds of techniques when they're trying to find out, for example, maybe an investigation or maybe a very important legal case. These are the skills that they would use. Reasoning with hypothesis, and we talked about hypothesis a few weeks back. And basically what that is science formulates and tests hypotheses in order to explain and predict phenomena. Hypothesis is a way to explain and predict something that might happen in the future. You create a hypothesis and then you use that hypothesis to determine what might happen in the future. Reasoning through statistics and probability. Again, these are very important methods that we use on a daily basis. I would say this particularly is important because the government uses these kinds of reasoning, statistics, and probability to determine funding, education needs, senior citizen needs, and how do they do that? Just the most, I would say the most prominent example would be a census that we take every 10 years. The U.S. counts its citizens every 10 years. And those numbers that we get from the U.S. Census are used for appropriation of congressional districts, of funding, and so forth. So we're able to use statistics, numbers, to actually come through and determine probability. But you got to remember about statistics. There's an old saying about statistics. There's lies, damn lies, and statistics. And basically what that means is, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, that statistics can be manipulated to determine or come to a determination for just about anything we want to determine. But we'll go more in depth about that later. And of course, when I say statistics, I mean primarily numbers. Okay. There's also fallacies, like we talked about fallacies last time. Well, when we're talking about inductive reasoning, there's certain fallacies that could occur with that as well. Just as one example, a hasty generalization fallacy. A fallacy of overgeneralizing or drawing conclusions from an insufficient sampling of parts. So you might want to say, you might draw a conclusion like this. People in Long Beach all love going to the beach. You might make a hasty generalization like that, but when you go inside and really see, it might be not all people in Long Beach like the beach just because they live there. There's different variations and variables that go along. So it's very important that we stay away from hasty generalizations as a final conclusion. And here we come with this questionable statistics. Like I said, the fallacy of often stacked. A lot of times when people are, particularly I would say politicians are famous for this, as well as journalists, when they're trying to prove a point, they call on statistics. But what we have to know if we're going to be critical thinkers is where do those statistics come from? Who formulated those statistics? What do they mean? And what are the studies and who did they study and how big was it? We have to really ask those kinds of questions when we look at numbers because they can be very deceiving. Contradictions and inconsistencies. The fallacy of making claims or offering evidence that contradicts the conclusion. And we do that all the time in our own just everyday lives and as well as other people. We contradict ourselves. We may say one thing and do another. That's usually what we think of as being contradictory. But this can happen as well as in argument, and it's called a fallacy. The loaded question. Now, we talked a little bit about the loaded question last time as well when we were introduced to fallacies. Loaded questions are questions that tend to be set up so they can get a certain response. Often we use inflammatory language, and that's the way of manipulation of language to come out with the response that you want to hear. A loaded question. A question that, something like, when did you stop beating your wife? Well, when did you stop beating your wife? We know that that's, first of all, says you beat your wife. And if you say yes to that question, it means, I beat my wife. You say no, it's like, I'm still beating her. So it's a loaded question. Very careful. The false analogy. Fallacies of basing an argument on comparison of two things that may have similarities but also significant differences. Two things that have similarities but have significant differences is a false analogy. And again, when you're talking about argument, people tend to do that to distract you from the main issue. A false cause. A fallacy of claiming a causal, and when I say causal, I mean cause and effect, something that causes something else to happen. So a false cause would be a fallacy of claiming a causal connection between events without reasonable and sufficient events to support the claim. Okay, so this happens in everyday life. Just take, for example, when we had that terrible hurricane in New Orleans. It's known now as Hurricane Katrina. And many people still believe to this day that the flooding occurred because of the hurricane. But as we know now with further research, that's not the only reason the flooding occurred. What was the other reason the flooding occurred? The levees broke. Okay, so we have to be very, very careful about making those hasty generalities, as I talked about before, as well as false conclusions or a false cause. Slippery slope. Now, this kind of a fallacy is very common where people imagine the worst case scenario. They say if one thing happens, if we allow one thing to happen, that if it's just a slope, the downward slope, that it's going to be, everything's just going to be shot. So people that believe in a slippery slope, they believe they have a vision of the future, and that in order for a terrible thing not to happen in the future, we can't allow this terrible thing to happen in the present. That's a slippery slope argument or fallacy. Now, for the E-Cafe, I want you to name the fallacy. You'll have to identify the fallacy. Give your own example, like you did last time. Give your own example of the fallacies of inductive reasoning that I've described and that we talked about, as well as have the other students, once you post your fallacy, they're going to have to determine what kind of fallacy it is. So use these that we just talked about in Unit 11 and create your own. And as well as this assignment, this is very interesting. I'm glad we're doing this for this particular unit. Imagine that you must explain inductive reasoning to your younger brother or sister, to a younger person. How would you describe an essential characteristics and rules so that this young person could understand? Now, I love anything that has to do with explaining or describing, because those are skills that we really need. Even me, I need to really be aware of and be sharp with, because if you're able to explain things, you're able to be a better communicator and a better critical thinker. So get working on those, and I will see you next time. Bye.